A second Donald Trump presidency could mean an upheaval in global geopolitics, especially for us here in Asia. It's unlikely that the incoming Trump administration will have as much tolerance for so-called hedging strategy by smaller nations and allies in this part of the world. Throughout the past 2 years or so, President Marcos Jr. has tried to make sure that while we're strengthening our defense relationship with the United States, we're also not completely burning our bridges with China. It's a hedging strategy, balancing between the two superpowers. With Donald Trump once again in the White House, that is looking extremely unlikely. I think there'll be more pressure on the Philippines to choose a side. But is that the best way forward? Is non-alignment the best strategy for the Philippines? Can U.S. treaty allies even hedge in between the superpowers? Let's talk to someone who knows a thing or two about hedging, non-alignment, and what middle powers can do in an era of intensified competition between U.S. and China. Dr. Lung, thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, there's so much I want to talk about, but can we start with the emphatic victory of Donald Trump, at least in terms of electoral college, and it looks like a trifecta is in the mix, plus a conservative Supreme Court. So many people are talking about realignment in American political landscape. From your perspective, a kind of a progressive perspective, and someone who's also an outsider, comes from Latin America, what was your general impression and read of the U.S. elections outcome and what it could mean for the world?
Well, thank you very much for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to be here. My first trip to the Philippines, so I'm very happy to be here. U.S. elections, I am concerned by the result. I think both options weren't really great for the future of humanity. For my region, both options were problematic. We can talk about that. But I think Trump was sensitively worse. He carries a message which is complicated from a number of perspectives, both on race issues, but also on gender issues. And of course, he's so far, we'll have to see what happens now, because he's quite unpredictable, so things can change. But he's been a climate change denier, which I think is a big problem for humanity, for our planet. So lots of concerns there. Now, on issues of foreign policy, which I understand is some of the things we're going to talk about, he is very ambivalent. I think there is a sort of intuitive part of Trump which is kind of more isolationist in nature. So he's not a knee-jerk imperialist. His first reaction isn't to start forever wars. And in that sense, that's reassuring. I also think there's a growing base in the United States that voted for him in the Republican Party, and which is part of his constituency, that is not neoconservative, that is not looking for new wars or new sort of militaristic adventures around the world. So that's reassuring. But then again, that base and the people who come from that isolationist tendency are not necessarily the people who are forming his cabinet. We've already seen that the people that are going to be the strongest.
Florida boys, we're hearing.
Yeah, we're seeing people who come from the more traditional neoconservative wing of the Republican Party, very aligned with sort of an aggressive pro-Israel stance, very anti-China, both rhetorically and in practice, and not friendly to sort of climate multilateralism, which is what we need right now. So I think there's a number of concerns, and particularly for Latin America. Also looking at what the first Trump administration looked like doesn't mean the second Trump administration will be identical, but the first Trump administration was extremely aggressive towards Latin America, reasserting old doctrines, including the Monroe Doctrine, supporting coups, which, the Obama administration kind of looked over some coups, including the one in Honduras in 2009, and wasn't great on all issues. But it's fair to say that the Obama administration didn't encourage coups, whereas the Trump administration openly did, several of them. In Venezuela, several that failed. One that was successful in Bolivia in 2019. New sanctions, literally strangling the Cuban economy and starving the country. And then almost encouraging a few governments to commit human rights violations in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Chile. The Trump administration was very bad for Latin America. So it remains to be seen. I mean, on some fronts, we know that he's going to try and de-escalate, probably Ukraine, where he's going to try and look for a more peaceful outcome. That could be positive for the world and lower the risk of nuclear warfare. On other fronts, we know that he wants to, really do the pivot to Asia, which we'll have to think what that means for the Philippines and for Southeast Asia and for the Asia-Pacific region. But I think it's very difficult to predict. Certainly, the new rumors about who this, his main national security staff are going to be, I think, are not very encouraging. And for his isolationist base, are probably not going to be satisfactory, because there is a strong Trumpist base that doesn't really trust the more traditional sectors of the Republican Party. You said the Miami boys. I mean, Marco Rubio and others are probably problematic for a significant sector of the people who voted for Trump. And so we'll have to see how Trump navigates this. So, I mean, lots of question marks.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big tent coalition. There are many tendencies inside. We saw that initially there was a pushback against suggestion of people like Senator Cotton or former Secretary of State Pompeo coming back. There's a lot of pushback against neoconservatives because of the experience of Trump dealing with the John Boltons of this world, and not to mention a lot of criticism of the legacy of the Bush administration, for instance. And the Cheneys obviously were very much central to the critique that Trump was making of traditional Republicans. Now, we had an earlier guest here, also Washington, D.C. from East West Center, who said that perhaps a better way of talking about this is to talk about insulationist approach rather than isolationist, because America is such a big empire that it will still be involved in everything, whether it wants it or not. It's more like insulating American interests in a much more protectionist sensibility. But I want to seize on that, because if you look at J.D. Vance and some of the folks, the podcast bros, who have a lot of influence within this new MAGA movement, they are very critical of free trade. And sometimes if you listen to them in terms of manufacturing, in terms of jobs, in terms of dealing with problems of Rust Belts, they sound like almost Bernie Sanders to me, right? And you had even influential folks like Joe Rogan, who used to be a Bernie bro, eventually, I think, going the other way precisely because maybe some of the more libertarian, some of the more free trade criticism was amenable to them. What is your read of that? Is this just performative? Is this just a co-optation of right of more progressive ideals? Or was this something that just made logical sense with so many Americans left out of the globalization project throughout the past quarter century?
I mean, logic is a difficult word to use right now in US politics. But I think, yeah, it's a mixture of things. I mean, clearly there was a deep felt anger against the Dems and the Democratic Party and the government of Joe Biden. I think, a lot of it is anti-systemic kind of response. So when it's anti-system, it can go either way, right? Some anti-systemic ideas come more from the right. Some anti-system ideas come more for the left. And in Trump's base, this is all a mishmash of things. My fear is that Trump isn't going to be that. I mean, I'm pretty anti-systemic in my approach to US policies. I think the US doesn't always play a very positive role in the world. But my fear is that all that will be diluted. Because ultimately, in Washington, D.C., what we call the blob, the foreign policy apparatus, the national security apparatus, which is a mixture of the administration, but also the deep state, the security apparatus, but also, the sort of think tanks,
lobbying
the lobby groups, all the people who think about the US's role in the world, the US's position in the world and its foreign policy. They have a lot of influence. And I'm not sure Trump really has the capacity to roll those people back or to do his real thing.
To defy their playbook, as
he
Obama
didn't
put
in
it.
his first administration. I mean, ultimately, you see a linear continuation between the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and then even the Biden administration.
Right.
There is a pivot to Asia, which Trump does not interfere with. There is a sort of withdrawal, gradual, with, ebbs and flows, but there is a withdrawal from the Middle East, which Trump didn't interfere with. In fact, he's the guy that started negotiations, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which then Joe Biden actually completed. So ultimately, in terms of foreign policy, you are seeing a movement which is coherent. Even if Trump, we know, can be very theatrical, can sort of sometimes, go against the grain, but a lot of this is aesthetics. It's not structural. And you mentioned the economy. You mentioned this difference between isolation and insular, but you mentioned the word protectionism. you could argue that ever since Obama was the last true neoliberal in many ways. With Trump, but also with Biden, you have a protectionist moment, and you have under Trump, and even more under Biden, a return to a more endogenous form of growth with public investment, with industrial policy. The IRA under Biden is a continuation of some of the things that started under Trump. Having a large deficit, which is something that was driven under Trump, but that continued under Biden, which is incredible, really. This is something that hasn't happened in U.S. history. I mean, it is a testimony to how exceptional the U.S. dollar economy is. If you had that kind of deficit anywhere else in the world, it would be, disastrous. And the American economy, still managed to have pretty much, a full employment economy with a little bit of inflation that's now gone down. It's been manageable. And all this associated to a more Cold War economy. So I think, one of the results of the 2008-2009 economic crisis, which hit China sooner in terms of policy, in the latter stages of the Hu Jintao presidency, and then soon after Xi Jinping became president, China rolled back some of its more neoliberal policies and went back to a more sort of affirmative Keynesian state planning, so on and so forth. It took the Americans a little bit longer, but they've essentially done the same. They thought, well, the only way to compete with China is to, have public money going to the tech industry and sort of stimulating endogenous growth. The Europeans, in many ways, have been the last to move back to this, to roll back neoliberal monetaristic economics, and only just starting to think about this now, right? With the French, for example, starting to run a bit of a deficit and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say here is ultimately Trump maybe is not such a freak phenomenon that we think.
He's a variation and a theme that we have been seeing building up. I mean, even Hillary Clinton went against the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which was the last hurrah of a neoliberal American foreign policy. And just for the purpose of our audience, when you say neoliberal, it's this kind of a ideological emphasis on free market economics, privatization, deregulation, everything that was there in the TPP deal, right? That horrified the Joseph Stiglitz of this world, who wondered about the impact on the sovereignty of states. There's a lot to discuss here because I want to eventually transition to Latin America's experience, because I think I absolutely agree with you that there is a bipartisan consensus, and it looks like the China threat, quote unquote China threat for Americans, has created that center of gravity that is going to affect whoever is in charge, whether it's Biden or Trump 2.0. But having said that, I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding or a historical understanding of what populism is. And I think this is where Latin America is very, very important, because much of the world, when you say populist, there's this idea of strongman leadership, right? A strongman tends to be essentially a demagogue, right? This is the stuff we read in the Platos of this world, Plato and Aristotle. But Latin America is quite an interesting case. I mean, at least personally, you could say, yes, Hugo Chavez eventually went down the road of much more authoritarian system, but we have many experiences from Bolivia to Chile, Colombia, among others, where you had populist leaders which did not necessarily lead to authoritarianism. So what is the Latin American experience? What is this so-called pink wave? And now they're talking about a pink wave 2.0. What is this evolution of Latin American populism that you think could be useful for the rest of the world, who have a very narrow understanding of populism as demagoguery, strongman leadership?
Yeah, I think the word populism is used very loosely. We often use it as a pejorative term. So the left uses it against the right when it's a right-wing strongman. The right uses it against the left when it's a left-wing strongman. Often it means a mixture of things, charismatic leadership, but also sort of anti-systemic tendencies, or even pro-poor, like populist economics of more states expenditure and so on, larger state budget. I mean, in the 90s, they used to talk of the neoliberal populists, right? I mean, I think sometimes it's overused. Ultimately, there is an anti-elite element of populism, I think, which is a recurrent phenomenon. Now, in a context like Latin America, which is one of the most unequal regions in the world, which still has very strong feudal structures, it's unsurprising to find, I would say, populist responses to politics, right? Because obviously the people who are in large part poor and living in these very unequal circumstances tend to rebel frequently and to express that rebellion in different ways, including in electoral terms, And so, and the vehicle is often a leadership or whatever. I think what's interesting, what happened in Latin America, you talked about the pink tide, which is a word that's used in the Anglo-Saxon world. Latin Americans are not really familiar with this.
What do they call it in Latin? Is there even a term for it?
The progressive governments, the post-neoliberal moment, the whatever. But I mean, pink tide's fine. I don't have a problem with it. It's just something we haven't really used. Is a moment after the disastrous decades of the 1980s and 1990s. It's ironic, actually. It's a shame because the 1980s were a decade of democratization in Latin America after the big military dictatorship third wave democratization. Dictatorships in the 60s, Cold War dictatorships, military dictatorships of the 60s and the 70s to make sure no communist response in Latin America. After the communist threat passes, you have a period of democratization, particularly in the 80s in Latin America. So sort of liberalization in political terms, but also neoliberalization in economic terms. And this fails because
meaning massive privatization of state
massive
assets.
privatizations, flexibilization of labor, what was called the Washington Consensus, free trade agreements, destroying national production. It was a disaster, which is a shame because if liberalization at the political level had been accompanied by good results on the social and economic front, people would have valued democracy more, right? And so what you had by the 1990s is a huge wave of political instability, the great rise of indigenous protests, for example, in Latin America, is the 1990s, the anti-neoliberal protests, the anti-privatization protests. All this in the 1990s creates a wave of chaos throughout Latin America. In my country, Ecuador, between 96 and 2006, we have 10 presidents. Right, 10 presidents. 7 presidents in 10 years. Right, 10 years, but 7 presidents.
So barely a year and a half each. Yeah.
So you can, and this is why protest, impeachments, no majorities, no governability, no capacity to govern. Why? Because neoliberal reform is creating massive impoverishment of the population, rise of inequality in an already unequal setting, and social movements, unions, protesting, etc. So the response to this is the pink tide, right? Saying, right, this neoliberal decade, even 2 decades, is a disaster. First, the election of Chavez in 1998, then Lula in Brazil in 2003, the Kirchners in Argentina, Nestor Kirchner in 2003. In 2005, it's Evo Morales in Bolivia. In 2007, it's Rafael Correa in my country. The Frente Amplio in Uruguay. In Chile, some social democrats.
Were they consciously feeding off on each other, or was this as a coincidence?
I think it's both, right?
Because there was not much social media back then. Like when Brexit happened, then Duterte won, then Trump. You could see the coalescing in terms of the information ecosystem. Was there such thing? Learning from each other, demonstration?
I think it's a real cyclical. There's a real cyclical, historic. The consequences of neoliberalism were felt everywhere in the same way. So I think the political result of this was similar everywhere.
Right.
And there's a cyclical nature of this, right? And it also has to do with the price of commodities, the cyclical nature of... So in Latin America, you do have these phases, just like you had the phase of military dictatorship, the phase of democratization.
Boom and
bust cycles. Yeah, that's right. There's a real cyclical element to this. But nevertheless, I would still say that the left was very heterogeneous.
Right.
It wasn't the same left. Hugo Chavez came from the military, Evo Morales came from the social movement, Lula was a trade unionist. In my country, Rafael Correa was a Chicago boy leftist, an economist with a PhD from University of Illinois, completely different profile. In Uruguay, the Frente Amplio comes from a much more social democratic tradition. In Chile, Bachelet comes from anti-dictatorship struggle, etc. So all very, very different, but one point in common. They wanted greater redistribution of wealth in very unequal setting, and they also wanted greater sovereignty vis-a-vis the United States, which has been a pretty aggressive hegemon historically in the Latin American region. And so that resulted in governments coming together and creating real regional organizations, but a real regional sovereignty moment in Latin American history, in which the region got together and did things together, imposed conditions on capital together, on big corporations, imposed conditions on the United States, I would argue, For example, in my country, it's a moment where the United States withdraws its military bases, for example, because the region did not want to be caught in these kind of rivalries between China and the
Spheres
United
of
States.
influence.
Spheres of influence.
Yeah.
And it's also, but also lots of positives. Like, for example, Colombia was the only country left with a really bad civil war. And so the region got together, and it was a civil war between a left-wing guerrilla and a right-wing government. So the region got together and said, come on, let's mediate and have a peace process. The Obama administration understood that this was a good moment and accepted the peace process. So the region went to the Obama administration saying, listen, it's time for it created, the Obama administration also was more reasonable than what came afterwards. So the Obama administration understood that Latin America was having
I mean, he met Hugo Chavez even in the...
But he was under pressure from the collective of Latin American, there was a real collective moment, right, of the collective action of Latin American states leading to Obama being more flexible on the Colombian peace process, meeting
Cuba.
And very importantly,
Cuba,
on Cuba. Obama is the first president to say the embargo that was instated in 1961, 1962, different phases, against Cuba has failed. It's impoverished Cuba. It's not led to regime change. It's unpopular in Latin America. There's one thing that unites Latin Americans, and I would say even across the political spectrum, even in the right wing.
Right.
People resent U.S. policy against Cuba. And every single summit of the Americas...
Because they're seen as a bully with this tiny Caribbean state.
Yeah. It's completely unfair. It's completely ridiculous. And it doesn't lead to regime change. On the contrary, it kind of strengthens the sort of most hardline sectors.
Authoritarian,
So it just doesn't work. So this was a real moment in, I think, and also it led to, it's not minor, between 2000 and 2012, 100 million people were lifted out of poverty in Latin America. In my country, we doubled our GDP in a period of 10 years. So, this was a successful left that wasn't anti-capital, that was pragmatic, that had investment. When you say
successful left, like what share of the vote are we talking about? 12%, 20%, 40%, 50%? What were the approval ratings of these progressive populist leaders?
So, for example, in my country, in Ecuador, it's the first time in history we have a government that lasts 10 years. We in Ecuador, it was political instability, as I've just argued.
Right, so 7 in 10 to 1 in 10 years.
Exactly.
Wow, that's quite a...
But it's first time since independence in 1822, right?
Wow.
We'd always had political instability. Other countries in Latin America that have more experience with like strong authoritarian long-term dictatorships, not in my country. So we had stable governance and, winning in the first round of elections, of presidential elections, without the need for a second round, without the need for a runoff, with, for example, in 2013, 56% of the vote, new constitutions, really refoundational moments, right? With parliamentary majorities, which was always the problem in Latin America. You never had parliamentary majorities. This depends from one country to the next, right? Some countries, Lula really never had a parliamentary majority. We did, so there's a lot of, again, heterogeneity in the region.
But nevertheless, some patterns.
But some patterns,
out,
So political stability, GDP growth, reduction of poverty, reduction of inequality, a diversification of foreign relations. It's the first time in our history that it's not just the US, that we have other players coming in Latin America, including obviously China. China becomes the biggest trading partner of a majority of South American states. Not all Latin American states, because in Central America and the Caribbean, the biggest trading partner is still the US. But for the larger countries in South America, Brazil, Argentina, and for most countries in South America, now the largest trading partner is China. So a diversification of relations, which of course from the perspective of Latin America was positive, because not having all your eggs in the same basket is always good.
So for so long you're used to having the Americans staring down at you, and now suddenly you have options.
That's right.
And that may explain why China, and I would say even other rival powers of US, tend to have much more positive traction in Latin American countries. There will be a backlash with the Bolsonaros. There'll be quite a backlash once the commodity boom was tapering off.
That's right. Yeah.
But nevertheless, now we're talking about a supposed second wave of this pink movement or pink wave or whatever you want to call it. What explains this resilience of the progressive left in Latin America?
That's a great question. I mean, there was a backlash from, I would say, 2015, 2016 onwards, When Dilma Rousseff was impeached in Brazil, that was a big symbolic moment. The Kirchners lost power in Argentina. Venezuela started its period of crisis, etc., etc. And it had to do with commodities decline for sure, and also political fatigue. When you've been in power for 10 years,
So long,
you know, we have young population. In Ecuador, you vote from the age of 16 onwards. The young generations wanted
Something
new
different.
faces, something different. So that's normal, that's part of democracy. And then Trump was in power as well.
Sure.
So there was a backlash. But even in the case of the Bolsonaro backlash you just mentioned, Brazilian elites, Bolsonaro was anti-Chinese and wanted a rupture with China. Brazilian elites, including large capitalist elites, refused the rupture with China. Why?
Because they were invested in
Because they were making lots of money.
Yeah.
So there are some patterns inherited from the pink tide that don't go away. There is now an economic resilience. There is now an institutionalized relationship, both with the US, which is not going away, and it's never going away. The US is always going to be a great power, and with China, right? So there are some things that are there to stay, if you see what I mean. And also, I think I would argue, you know, I come from a left in the 90s when we were successful. You know, we got 5% of the vote, you know, and that was, we would celebrate. But after coming to power and having governed for 10 years, you have cadres who have been ministers, who have been in strong positions. You have experience. You have things. You have
think tanks.
You know, you have think tank. You've given free healthcare to people. You've given free education.
You have a
to
constituency.
People. You have a constituency. People remember. Oh yeah, maybe we were better off. Maybe there were less drug cartels when these guys were in power because there was less poverty. So you are competitive in the political system. It doesn't mean you're going to win all elections. You know,
you're in the conversation.
You have some weaknesses. You also have some enemies. You also have some people who didn't like your government. But you are the other 50% of the political spectrum. This was not the case in Latin America before we came to power. Now we are the other 50%. When we lose elections, we lose them with 45%, with 43%, with 48%, not with 5% as we did in the past. So there is the possibility of coming back into power, which is why there's been talk of a new pink tide. I'm not sure I like the term. I think there are more pendular swings, basically, between left and right. But you now have a left-wing government in Colombia. Lula's back in power in Brazil. Chile, Mexico. You've just had the election of Claudia Sheinbaum after 6 years of AMLO, so there's continuity for the left there. Mexico's important.
First female, first Jewish background.
And it's the second largest economy in Latin America after Brazil. So now the first and second economy in Latin America. Just Brazil and Mexico together, it's more than half the population of Latin America. And they're governed by left-wing governments. So I think, yes, it's true to say that the left in Latin America is here to stay. It's not going to be hegemonic. It has to contend with right-wing forces, but it's part of the political reality of Latin America.
But I want to ask you, this is a very important point, the resiliency of the left. In fact, not only resiliency, competitiveness of the left in Latin America in a very feudalistic, unequal conditions, the shadow of America, great power competition. This is something almost all of us in the rest of the global South can relate to. And yet, I wonder, again, I know you don't want to come here and lecture, but you see, I'm sure when you go all around the world, of course, Europe too, you know, factionalism is the name of the game for the left and progressives. Like sometimes, like, I mean, our joke among Filipinos, you put 2 Filipinos there, you get 3 organizations out of them, right? What was the secret sauce in Latin America to make sure that the usual factionalism and fragmentation we see in progressive leftist movement all around the world was bridged enough to create these Big Ten coalitions? I mean, what is the coalition building culture? I mean, for instance, I was just looking at the Chilean elections, whereby, you know, the eventual victor had a decent plurality, but in the runoff was able to get more than 50%. With Lula also, right? You were able to. So how come they're so good? This again, everything is relative in building those coalitions. Even though you could say that the solid base of left, whether it's Brazil and Chile, could be maybe 20, 25%, but they can't build that 50. How can they work with centrist forces, even conservative Christian democratic forces?
So you hint at collective action, which is very important, right? I mean, whether it's between states or whether it's within national constituencies, the only way you're going to get power and, you know, at the global level, fight against divide and rule or race to the bottom practices is by uniting. Uniting is fundamental. Unity is the only way to triumph. And in Latin America, I think we were in a very similar situation as the left in the Philippines in the 90s. We were all divided, fighting amongst each other.
Very similar background. We
sectarian.
had our dictatorship, also our
Very
own.
similar.
Yeah, very
many,
similar.
many similar aspects, yes. I think it's true to say that Chavez's win in the late 90s was just a huge surprise for us. And then in 2002, when he actually survived a coup, I mean, who survives a US-supported military coup? Because it was a US, George Bush-endorsed military coup in 2002. And the people from the shanty towns, from the favelas, you know, in Venezuela called them the barrios, brought him back. And so people on the left, including myself, you know, we were all in opposition. I thought, my God, this is possible.
Right.
You can not only be elected, but you can survive a US-supported military coup. And when Lula was elected, and then Kirchner, I think, you know, there was a real understanding that we had to be united, that we had to be pragmatic, that we had to really strive to create broad electoral coalitions. Clearly, I'm not saying that we have to abandon our ideology. We have to be strong in our beliefs, and we can stick to our ideals, but we do have to be pragmatic.
So you mean the constant...
And not sectarian. You know, we really have to build bridges with the people that are more or less like-minded in order to build these electoral platforms to come to power.
The threat of being deposed violently is just so real. There's no time for vacuous sloganeering and all of that. There's that kind of realism that helped you guys. But I think it would be unfair for me not to also raise this issue, because the problem is from the outside. When you say Latin American left, immediately, oh, look at Venezuela, or even look at Cuba and all. I mean, we can talk about Cuba's healthcare being better than most Asian countries, but the fact of the matter is that we had catastrophic consequences. I have friends from Venezuela and all who are not necessarily with the conservative reactionary forces, but they cannot deny it's a total disaster what's happening in Venezuela. What are the lessons from what went wrong with the progressive or leftist-oriented movement, and how has that informed other Latin American countries? It looks like Morales in Bolivia, for instance, is making sure that we're doing it differently. There's more indigenous, inclusive, because back in the day it was like Morales and Hugo Chavez and Cuba and all of them put together. But now you can see that there's this emphasis that not all left are the same. As you said, heterogeneous. How heterogeneous? And what are the lessons you also learned from the catastrophe in Venezuela?
Yeah, absolutely heterogeneous, right? So Cuba being a more classical communist single-party state, right? All the way to sort of liberal democracies with social democratic, sort of center-left. So the pink tide was absolutely heterogeneous, right? But I think on certain international platforms, they stood together defending certain issues to regulate capital, more sovereignty, more non-alignment in the international system. I think you find pockets of unity within a very heterogeneous left.
Right.
On the issue of Venezuela, I think Venezuela is kind of the polemic issue, and it's also a bit of an exception. I think Venezuela really faced an ongoing regime change policy from the United States. The United States really focused all its efforts on overthrowing Chavismo in Venezuela from day one. From 1999 onwards, there was a 2002 coup supported by the United States, which failed against Chavez. Then there was a 2003 oil strike, which paralyzed oil production in Venezuela. Venezuela is 90% dependent on oil, right? Supported by the United States. And then ongoing polarization encouraged by the United States, with the opposition refusing to participate in elections for decades. Can you imagine what it does to democracy when the opposition refuses to participate in elections? It just refused to participate in elections which were recognized as democratic by the Carter Center, by observer groups, and the United States encouraging this. So what you create is polarization. What you create is a state that becomes more and more a security state. You know, if you organize one coup, maybe the military is going to be purged. If you organize two coups, maybe the military is going to be super purged. If you organize three coups, you're going to make the regime much more paranoid and much more security conscious. By the time you're reaching, the United States recognizing a parallel government in the figure of Juan Guaido, which has never existed in the world. Not even Cuba's had to face a parallel government in Miami recognized by the Organization of American States. This is never done before in the history of Latin America, where you actually give someone who was not elected, who is not ousted, some guy that they say, no, we recognize him as the president, and then you ask all your NATO allies to recognize him as the legitimate president of Venezuela. This is not someone who was ousted. This is not a government in exile. This is not someone who lost the election unfairly, or he didn't even run any elections, right? So lots of
So you're not willing to accept that there could have been responsibility too?
So I think there's a lot of response. So I'm coming to this. But what I'm saying is that Venezuela was really, the government of Venezuela was really pushed into becoming a very tight-knit security state, very, very conscious.
Right.
And a security state isolates itself more and more and more and more and more, right? That's the problem. That's, I think, what's happened in Venezuela. So I think the US bears a big burden of responsibility, imposing sanctions, starving the government of Venezuela of funds. If you impose sanctions on an oil-producing state and it can't export its oil and it has no revenue, then obviously 5 to 6 million people are going to leave the country. The refugee crisis was largely manufactured by the United States. Now, this does not mean that I agree with every decision that was made by Venezuela. I think the last elections in Venezuela were problematic. The think tank that I worked for did a very detailed technical analysis of the elections. There are a number of countries still asking for the electoral results to be published. I think there were a number of economic mistakes that were made by the Venezuelan governments. I think there are a number of problematic issues in Venezuela without a doubt. But I do think that those were driven. There was a strategy on behalf of the United States to make Venezuela into a pariah,
so
and to make Venezuela into an outlier.
It's an exceptional catastrophe because it faced exceptional sabotage.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the history of sanctions, of US sanctions in Venezuela, it is exactly the same curve of the sanctions, which affects the curve of exports, there's an exact correlation with refugees, GDP, everything, all the humanitarian impacts and all the economic and social indicators go hand in hand with the sanctions. And then the US kind of sold this idea that it was economic mismanagement. How can you not have economic mismanagement when you have 90% of Venezuela's exports, which was all oil to the United States, being, completely cut off?
You could raise the case of Russia and Iran, also oil exporting countries, who have held stronger and more consolidated despite facing real threats from the outside.
So there's a big, here I'm going to put my academic hat on. Sanctions can either completely destroy you or actually serve as almost protectionist policies that help diversify your economy.
Build an industrial manufacturing base, which Iran and Russia did.
Iran and Russia could be success sanction stories. Iran is more of a mixed bag.
Somewhere in between.
Yeah, but Russia is certainly a success story of sanctions. It's incredible, but since the European Union imposed agricultural sanctions on Russia in 2014...
They have a revival of domestic manufacturing.
They've created a massive agricultural boom. Now they're self-reliant on beef and on other agricultural goods in Russia. Why? Because it went against neoliberalism. It went against free trade. It created this kind of almost, exogenously imposed protectionism and created a real growth of certain sectors of the economy.
They have the scale, and there's the China being just across.
Yeah,
again,
so they have China
I want to be
just on
also
the other
fair.
side.
Yeah, I raised it, but obviously the academic will say they're very incomparable cases.
But Cuba is the opposite case. Cuba is the case that's 90 miles away from Florida, very far from China.
Exactly.
Very small economy.
Very small.
Very dependent on all
tourism and all. Yeah.
Oil, food,
everything.
Tourism, etc. The reverse of China, of Russia, which is a huge country. Cuba is a tiny country, and this is a typical example of where sanctions create. We're on the verge of a failed state. I mean, Cuba right now is having a huge crisis with food shortages, energy shortages, everything. So sanctions can have really both impacts.
I want to transition now to our part of the world, and we can talk about ASEAN and the Philippines and what can the middle powers do here. Can you tell me about the regionalist experience in Latin America? What are the lessons there? What are the success stories, and what are the gaps that you think you have to fill up? And again, I know you're not in this, pontification. You don't like doing that, but probably what are the lessons also for ASEAN and other regional bodies who are also caught in between superpowers? What is your experience in Latin America?
So this region here, Southeast Asia and the Philippines, is clearly going to face huge challenges. We'll have to see what those look like during the Trump administration. But over a longer period, we know that there is sort of an impending Cold War between China and the United States. What does this mean for the country of Southeast Asia? What does this mean for the Philippines? I mean, it's not my place to tell the Filipino people and the Filipino government what to do. But I mean, I always think that we shouldn't be useful idiots in the strategies of either great powers, right? This means defending our own national interests. And defending our own national interests when we're countries of the global south means being non-aligned. By definition, you have to defend your own interest. And you have to diversify your strategies and your options, right? To side completely with one side, I think is dangerous. And so, but the problem with that is that it's very difficult to do that when you're a single country, because the weight of the Philippines or the weight of my country, Ecuador, when you're dealing with the United States or when you're dealing with China, is not sufficient. So the best way to do this is to have a regional strategy, to have a group of countries, which is kind of what we tried to do when we created in South America the Union of South American Nations called UNASUR, where the 12 of us got together and we imposed conditions. We imposed conditions on multinational corporations. We imposed conditions on great powers. We said, you want to invest here? Okay, these are the rules of the game. But they're going to be rules of the game not just in my country. They're also going to be the rules of the game next door. So you can't do this kind of game of
playing us against each other.
Yeah, playing us against each other, race to the bottom. He's offering me more. He's going to tax me less. He's going to pay less his workforce. He's going to have less environmental regulations. All this kind of stuff, which means that we're always competing on a race to the bottom. So this is what you need to do. In UNASUR, we tried to do this. So there's been some reversals since, but we're trying to rebuild it. It's what you need to do in ASEAN. In UNASUR, we even had a number of policies on the infrastructure front, education, healthcare, for example, in the context of pandemics, to be able to import vaccines together. If you have more muscle as a group of 12 countries, you're going to be able to get cheaper drugs, get more volumes, more bargaining power, all this kind of stuff, right? Which is why even the Europeans, who are much stronger nations than us, they realized this in the 1940s and 1950s, that they had the Soviet Union and the United States, and therefore they had to create the European Union. And they called it strategic autonomy. This is the European word for it. We need strategic autonomy, and strategic autonomy from the US and Soviet Union. Therefore, we need what General de Gaulle called the third bloc, the European Union. It doesn't have to be exactly like the European Union, but it's the same idea, collective action. And in the case of security threats, in UNASUR, we created the Council of Defense. And the idea was, we're not going to train all our officers in the United States so that they get nicely brainwashed in West Point and so on and become loyal to the United States. We want our officers and our generals to be loyal to us, so we will train them in the region. We are going to make our defense budgets transparent to our neighbors. So we made all our defense budgets transparent. Before they were secret.
Even white papers and all.
Yeah, we made also, they knew how many missiles we had. And you know what? That created trust between neighboring states. And so it slowed down the arms race between neighboring states, right? And it creates better relations between the military, and it helps consolidate the region, and the region then starts to have a joint vision of what its strategic interests are, including in the context of global power rivalry. It's not simple. It's not with a magical wand. It takes sometimes decades to consolidate. But if you go towards that direction, you will create a Southeast Asian response to the current challenge, not accepting the United States using Southeast Asia to contain China in a militaristic fashion, which I think is unfair for Southeast Asia, because ultimately, if there is a war, it's going to be Southeast Asian lives. It's not going to be significant US lives, right? And also not to accept maybe China's visions on what it means in terms of, UN law of the sea, or its own interpretation of these things that could be maybe problematic from a Southeast Asian perspective. So also to have unity in terms of how you address those issues with China itself, right? Global powers are global powers, right? I think, from my experience, China is more benign in some aspects, certainly in terms of security. I mean, the United States has more than...
Well, you can say that from Latin America. I'm not sure we can say that from the Philippines.
Just look at this data. More than 700 US military bases in the world.
Because
outside
they've been
of the
a
US.
superpower for more than a century. China is a
One
new
Chinese
superpower.
base in the world, right? I mean,
Djibouti,
that is a big,
yeah,
there's a big difference, right? Now, this may change. You're absolutely right.
They're
This
a
may
new
change.
superpower,
We
yeah.
should not be naive.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we should be naive. But, there are no wars in which China is involved. There are many wars in which the US has been involved, right? Regardless of whether you come from the Americas or whether you come from Southeast Asia, there is a legacy there. It doesn't mean that Chinese companies behave well, or they shouldn't be regulated, or that you shouldn't be suspicious of Chinese need for raw materials, or that Chinese doesn't always, for example, at the UN, problems with Chinese defending intellectual property rights that I would question, or defending free trade agreements that I would question, or defending investment state dispute settlement mechanisms that I would question. So I'm not trying to say that China is a benign global power that we can trust and everything's fine. No, we must not be naive, and we must be non-aligned. And non-aligned means non-alignment from China, and non-alignment from the United States, and non-alignment from everyone. We have to defend our own national interest. But I do think that, often, we're seeing it, the US is not always the adult in the room, right? They have a lot of...
That's why we started with Trump 2.0.
Yeah.
Last point, BRICS.
Yeah.
What's up with BRICS? Because we're hearing a lot about BRICS, including Southeast Asia, right? Especially after Iran and Ethiopia and Egypt.
Yeah.
A couple of new countries got in.
Malaysia now in.
Malaysia is very much for it. Prime Minister Anwar has made a lot out of it. Indonesia demurred last year, but nevertheless the conversation is there because they want to join OECD down the road. Philippines, not as much conversation around that yet. You are based in Washington, D.C. Does BRICS matter to them? And in what ways does it really matter? In what ways could it matter down the road in terms of global South coming together, a real global level non-aligned movement?
It's fascinating because the BRICS really, it's an acronym, but there's a membership, but it still doesn't really exist in terms of its
Wall Street
institutions.
acronym.
I mean, it's actually a Wall Street acronym. That's right. Yeah. I mean, it is starting to create institutions, but those institutions are very slowly building up. I mean, we'll have to see what happens to the new development bank, which is the BRICS Bank.
Right.
That, if it really has muscles and it start competing with the IMF, then that will be a real institution, right? It's starting to lend a little bit, but it's still marginal amounts. But believe me, in the West, in Washington, the BRICS is the cookie monster, right? It does matter, and it matters a lot. It's in all the media. Western governance is really worried about BRICS. They're really scared of the BRICS. And I'm kind of like that. I think this is good. Why? Because Western governance and the institutions of Western governance, including the Bretton Woods institutions, are terrible institutions. They've done a lot of damage. I think the IMF has been one of the main drivers of poverty and inequality in the world. I mean, I write a lot about the IMF. We can do this on another program maybe, but I think the IMF has created a lot of hardship in the world.
Your think tank has been a great source of data for us, especially in Latin America,
Yeah, in Latin America, but not just in Latin America, the IMF has been terrible. And so if you have a threat from the BRICS saying, if you do not reform the Bretton Woods institutions, if the West doesn't understand that we're not in a post-World War II moment, as several decades have elapsed since then, and we need to change global governance, we need to democratize global governance. It can't just be the US waving its veto every time it doesn't like something, and the global South matters. If the BRICS is a threat and is offering, an alternative to all these countries, then maybe Western governments will start thinking, oh, I need to reform, I need to be more global South friendly. And I think that's a positive outcome. So far, the BRICS doesn't really exist, but it is certainly a fear factor in the West.
It creates that strategic space. On that cautiously optimistic note, thank you very much for that.
It's been a great
conversation. That was
conversation.
really a great conversation. I hope this will be a beginning of more conversation on that, because as Filipinos, I always felt dealing with Latin American brothers and sisters came very naturally. So this is a conversation we needed. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify and YouTube. I'm Richard Heydarian. That was The View from Manila, where One News, all sides, all the time.